Hi, if you don't know me, my name is Kirsten. You can find me on Instagram as JamReaderson Twitter as JamReaderson, and TikTok as JamReaderson. But here on YouTube, I've been doing a series that I like to call Quickview with the Vampire, a series in which I review the newest Interview with the Vampire episode in the most efficient way possible. I do apologize, however, that my quick views are getting longer and longer as the season progresses, and that we are drifting out of that 15 to 30 minute territory and venturing closer to an hour. But given all that the show has to tell us, it would be criminal to not get into some detail, even in a quick review. If you haven't seen any of my quick view videos before, here is the general setup that I've created. I have 4 categories that I talk about. The first one is favorite scenes. The second one is called Big Talk. It's where I talk about reoccurring themes that happen throughout the show. The third one is a category of choice. And then the fourth one is my favorite category, my predictions. Now, as there are predictions, this is my warning now that this is not a spoiler-free channel. I will be referencing the novels, sometimes just Interview with the Vampire, and sometimes any of the other 12 books, give or take what the subject matter is. So if you've gone into season 2 unaware of what happens and you'd like to keep it that way, turn around and save yourself. This is also my warning for this video in particular that the topics of suicide and abuse will be discussed. Discussion will be completely in the context of the show, but if you find that subject matter heavy and you don't want to sit around and listen to it, you may also want to turn around. But if you want to talk about this episode, if you want to rehash all the drama that happens between Armand and Louis, if you want to get to the root of what memory is, and if you want to find out what happened in San Francisco in 1973, stick around as we talk about Interview with the Vampire Season 2, Episode 5. Don't be afraid, just start the tape. My first category is favorite scenes, and once again I am struggling to narrow down discussion given that every single scene in this episode was perfect. So to avoid talking about every scene, I'll be discussing the scenes that I think had the most impact on either characters, impact on the audience, and or both. As I work in chronological order, that puts our first scene as the absolutely insane fight between Armand and Louis at about 20 minutes into the episode. So let's set the scene. Louis has brought a young reporter home. He invited Armand along, but Armand declined, leaving just Louis and this boy alone in this apartment for hours and hours. And instead of doing the usual, which is sleeping with and then draining for a drug-high meal, Louis actually decides to put this boy's job to use and begins to tell his life story. When this boy crosses a line, when this boy's takeaway from what Louis is saying doesn't align with what Louis wanted him to take away from the story, Louis then attacks him. And this is where Armand comes in. And with Armand comes the knowledge to both Louis and to us as the audience that the sun is up and that Louis is walking a horribly dangerous line. And then the fight starts. And what a fight it is. Armand is furious from the get-go. And the sun is up, the room's destroyed, and Louis has chosen someone else to spend his time with. And while Armand could perhaps forgive had Louis just slept with and drained as he usually does, as he's done with 128 others, my little Catholic boy. It's hard to forgive when Louis has entrusted his feelings and his story with someone else, feelings and a story that are centered around Lestat and not Armand at all. And it's because of this, and because of Louis' drug-addled brain, and because of the very obvious years' worth of brewing resentment that this fight explodes. Louis calls Armand boring, something that Armand explicitly mentioned last episode when confiding his story with Louis was something he felt and feared because of those that had abandoned him in the past. And Armand quickly strikes back with a mockery of Louis and his, oh, it's so hard to be me. It's so hard to kill humans. I can feel their feelings as I drain them. Everyone I know wrongs me, etc., etc., etc. And Louis, when given a low blow, goes straight to hell. And in his counter, starts throwing Armand's sexual trauma back in his face. Now, Armand doesn't let that slow him down though, because immediately he starts bringing up Paul's suicide, Grace's fear and resentment and even hatred of Louis and his vampiric state. And then, worst of all, Claudia and Lestat was gut-wrenching, was full of nothing but festering hatred for the situation that their relationship has them both in. And it was done so well, and it's insane to me that this was the first bit that they filmed as Louis and Armand. Like, this was the basis of Louis and Armand's relationship as they went into filming this year. Crazy. Second of all, the bigger picture is that a fight of this level doesn't come from nowhere. It immediately highlights to us that something in the time from Paris to San Francisco has gone severely wrong. Now, obviously, if you've read the book, or frankly, if you have been online at all in this fandom, you're more than aware that Claudia dies at the trial that's put on by the Théâtre des Vampires, and you're a little bit more aware of Armand's role in Claudia's death. And while Louis does know in the novels that Armand had something to do with Claudia's death, the extent of it is something that we weren't even privy to until Armand's actual book came out in 1998. But this alone explains how Armand and Louis operate in the years between Paris and their inevitable separation. And it does in the book, and I believe it does so in the show. Now, on page 291 of Interview with the Vampire, and I want to preface real quick that all of my Vampire Chronicles books are first edition, so when I'm referencing like a page number, it's for that specific edition. But on page 291, Louis discusses the immediate way that he and Armand end their time in Paris after the trial, and they also discuss how Louis is aware that though Armand was his companion, Louis was entirely closed off to Armand because of the role that Armand played in Claudia's death. And this is something that's referenced in the episode when Armand is talking to a sun-destroyed Louis, talking about atoning for Paris. So if we look at 291, ignore all the sticky notes, I promise there's a rhyme and reason to it. Page 291 is the beginning of part 4 of Interview with the Vampire. And Louis says, "For a long time I thought that Claudia's death had been the cause of the end of things, that if I had seen Madeleine and Claudia leave Paris safely, things might have been different with me and Armand. I might have loved again and desired again, and sought some semblance of mortal life with which could have been rich and varied, though unnatural. But now I have come to see that was false. Even if Claudia had not died, even if I had not despised Armand for letting her die, it would have all turned out the same. Coming slowly to know this evil, or being catapulted into it, it was all the same. I wanted none of it finally, and, deserving nothing better, I closed up like a spider in the flame of a match. And even Armand, who was my constant companion and my only companion, existed at a great distance from me, beyond that veil which separated me from all living things, a veil which was a form of shroud." Okay. Now, on page 272 of The Vampire Armand, Armand discusses how his and Louis' relationship was post-Paris. And he says, so he says, "Why did he," talking about Louis, "come away with me afterwards? Why did he not abhor the one who he blamed for Claudia's death? You were their leader. You could have stopped them. He did say those words to me. Why did we wander for so many years together, drifting like elegant phantoms in our lace and velvet into the garish electric lights and electronic noises of the modern age? He remained with me because he had to do it. It was the only way that he could go on existing, and for death he has never had the courage and never will. And so he endured after the loss of Claudia, just as I had endured through the dungeon centuries and through the years of tawdry boulevard spectacle, but in time he did learn to be alone. Louis, my companion, dried up of his own free will, rather like a beautiful rose skillfully dehydrated in sand, and so that it retains its proportions, nay, even its fragrance and its tint. For all the blood he drank, he himself became dry, heartless, a stranger to himself and to me." So, this coldness that shows up between Louis and Armand is something that they both discuss, right? And while Louis in the show may not seem like the emotionless and cold thing that he is described to be in the books, he still is. There's no real emotion with him. There's no intimacy. There's no passion for Louis and Armand. Louis is an addict, barely getting through the day, and there's nothing there for them, not in 1973 San Francisco. And that is what, of course, makes Dubai so interesting. The next scene I want to talk about is Louis remembering walking into the sun. Jacob Anderson wears anguish like nobody else. He is beautiful and heartbreaking, and the scene of him walking out is so beautifully done. It's a scene that's interspersed with a lot of different things. There's him actually walking into the sun. There's the blurry journey up the stairs. There's his skin burning away. Armand yelling, Louis' own cries, and then over it all is this beautifully sad piano piece. And the dawning realization on Louis' face in Dubai as he remembers for the first time in 50 years what happened is haunting. And then as Louis' eyes fill with these blood tears as he and Daniel go through this memory, we see our 1973 Louis in the aftermath, and as simplistically as I can say it, we see his pain. And there's so much to talk about in this scene, but one of my favorite things is Daniel, because Daniel and Louis in Dubai have had an interesting relationship. This is a job, and they've both been slightly antagonistic, to say the least, to each other at times. And as season 1 ended and as season 2 began, it really did start to feel as though it was an Armand and Louis versus Daniel situation. But the true shift happens at this exact moment. Louis says in this broken voice, I walked out into the sun. And Daniel just has this look on his face as he says, I think so. And it's a look that continues as he almost pleadingly tells Louis to get the story straight first. And it's so obvious in this moment that Daniel cares. Daniel cares what happened to Louis in San Francisco. Daniel cares about this memory that's been taken from Louis. Daniel cares about Louis. In the books, Louis does try to commit suicide. It was one of my predictions that I talked about in my first Quickview video, my 1-4 season 2 episode 1, because of the comment Louis makes about I won't walk into the flame or walk into the sun as long as you're around talking to Claudia. In the 7th book, Merrick, Louis goes out into the sun with the intention of dying after working with a witch to summon the ghost of Claudia. I'm not going to get into the whole plot of Merrick because Merrick herself and David Talbot, a character I really don't wish to see in the AMC world, though I do assume he will make at least an appearance. They're not relevant right now. But on page 243 of Merrick, Louis and Claudia's ghost first speak. And it's here that the comment Armand made during the fight and that comment about Claudia not loving Louis kind of has any merit. And so when Claudia first appears, it says, a voice came out, fresh and sweet, a girl's natural treble. Why have you called me, Louis? It asked with heartbreaking sincerity. Why have you roused me from my wandering sleep for your own consolation? Why wasn't memory enough? And this is David that's narrating, by the way. Louis is not the narrator. And Louis immediately asks Claudia, where is your spirit? Is it at rest or does it wander? Would you have me come to you? Claudia, I'm ready. Claudia, I'm ready to be at your side. You come to me? The child asked. The little voice had taken on a dark, deliberate coloration. You, after all those many years of evil tutelage, you think that I and death would be united with you? The voice went on. I loathe you, evil father, it confided, and a dark laughter came from the small lips. Father, understand me, she whispered, her face infected with the tenderest expression. I never could find words to tell you truths when I was living. There was the sound of breath, and a visible despair seemed to wrap itself about the creature. In this measureless place, I have no use for such curses, said the voice with touching simplicity. What is it to me, the love you lavished on me once in a vibrant and feverish world? You want vows from me? She said with seeming wonder, her whisper growing softer. And from the coldest heart imaginable, I condemn you. Condemn you that you took my life. Condemn that you had no charity for the mortal I once was. Condemn you that you saw in me only what filled your eyes and insatiable veins. Condemn you that you brought me over into the lively hell which you and Lestat so richly shared. And then she goes on, and it gets progressively worse as she says, take your life, yes. Give it up in memory of me. Yes, I would have you do it. I would have you give over to me your last breath. Do it with pain for me, Louis. Do it with pain that I might see your spirit through the whirlwind struggling to free itself from your tormented flesh. And it just like keeps going. And then she reaches forward and like shoves her hand into his chest. And it says, the blood gushed out of Louis's heart. His face was knotted, his mouth open, his eyes shut. Forgive me, he whispered. He gave a soft groan of pure and terrible pain. And she's still not done with any of this. And she continues to go about talking about things. And we have our very own come to me moment between Claudia and Louis here, where on page 247 it says, come Louis, she said faintly, the sound of her invitation mingling with the softly stirring trees. Come into this dreary place with me and leave behind your comforts. Leave behind your wealth, your dreams, your blood-soaked pleasures. Leave behind your ever-hungry eyes. Leave it all. Leave it for this dim and insubstantial realm. And she says, come to me, father, said the child, the voice toneless now, devoid of feeling. The image was transparent and dim. Come to me, she whispered, her voice dry and thin. Come, do it with the deep pain as your offering. You'll never find me. Come. So needless to say that Louis' suicide in the show isn't unexpected. Him saying that he hears Claudia calling to him running out to meet her, to be with her. It's all very fitting. But it didn't make it any easier to watch. Shifting a little bit away from Louis now, though I will return to him by the end of this. The third scene I wish to discuss is the "Is that what makes you fascinating?" conversation between Daniel and Armand. This is a short horror film in the middle of an episode. Louis and Daniel are entirely at Armand's mercy at this point. And I mean, the crux of it all is that they were always at Armand's mercy, but it's never been more obvious than it is here. Armand is jealous, Armand is hurt, and Armand is a very lost boy. He's taking everything that Daniel is saying and twisting it, trying to gauge if this particular thing is what makes Louis want to talk to Daniel and not to Armand. He starts going through Daniel's head, pulling out memories that shape Daniel and memories that showcase Daniel's personality, both the good and the bad, to figure out if this is what Louis sees in Daniel. And when Armand says, "You're going to teach me how to be fascinating," and then a moment later says, "Louis says I'm boring. Do you find me boring?" It is such a highlight of how separated from humanity vampires can get, and how separated Armand is from humanity, and how almost alien it is. The way that he's like, "Teach me how to be like you so that I might fit in here." But at the core of this, Armand could heal Louis. Would it be an automatic healing? No, but he could. Powerful blood heals. At least in these books it does. In Merrick, after Louis' suicide attempt, he's brought back by Lestat, actually. We first learn about his suicide in Merrick on page 278. David Talbot, again, who's our narrator of this novel, finds Louis' suicide note. The important parts reading on pages 278 and 279. I'm going to skip around a little bit because there's things that don't matter. So David tells us he had done a most careful thing. He had brought his coffin, a relic, and to the rear courtyard of the townhouse in the Rue Royale, a most secluded and high-walled place. He had left his last letter on the desk upstairs, a desk which all of us, I, Lestat, and Louis, had at one time used for important writings of our own. Then he had gone down into the courtyard, and he had removed the lid from the coffin, and he had laid down in it to receive the morning sun. He had addressed to me his candid farewell. If I'm correct, I will be cremated by the sunlight. I am not old enough to remain as one severely burned, or young enough to bequeath bloody flesh to those who come to carry off what is left. I shall be ashes as Claudia once was ashes, and you, my beloved David, must scatter those ashes for me. So then he goes on about things that are not relevant to us right now. But on 279, he says, as for my sweet master Lestat, when he wakes, tell him that I went into the darkness without hoping for his terrifying angels, that I went into the darkness expecting only the whirlwind or the nothingness, both of which he has in his own words so often described. Ask him to forgive me that I could not wait to take my leave of him. And then he ends it with, I go now to what I regard as a certainty, the form of death which took my Claudia, relentless, inescapable, absolute. And I won't get into what was going on with Lestat too much here. Just know that Lestat had, for lack of like any other explanation, been in a coma-like state for a hot minute and hadn't woken up for really anything at this point. But when he does wake, it is because of Louis' suicide attempt. And then on page 281, he comes into the scene where David and Merrick are mourning over what to do. And it's here that we kind of get to see the beginning of an attempt to save Louis. So at once, again, this is David, as if in answer to my pathetic prayer, I heard the creak of the carriageway gate. I heard the low shriek of its old hinges as it was thrown open, and then the click as it was closed once more, iron upon iron. No scent of a mortal signaled an intruder. In fact, I knew the step that was approaching. I had heard it so many times in my life, both mortal and preternatural. Yet I didn't dare to believe in such a rescue from my misery until the unheralded figure appeared in the courtyard, his velvet coat dusty, his yellow hair tangled, his violet eyes looking at once to the grim and appalling visage of Louis. It was Lestat. And so blah, blah, blah. We have like this whole like Lestat discovering what's happened. And then on page 284 and 285, the attempt to save Louis from the destruction that's been done to his body happens. And it happens through Lestat's really powerful blood. And so on 284, he says, and if I spill my blood down into this coffin now, Lestat asked, what do you think will come back? Do you think it will be our Louis that will rise in these burnt rags? What if it's not? What if it's some wounded revenant that we must destroy? And then he goes and talking about how his blood's really strong and blah, blah, blah. Then on page 285 is where he actually goes ahead and does it. And it says, he drew back, kneeling up and lifting his right hand to his mouth, he gashed his wrist with his own teeth before either Merrick or I knew what he meant to do. At once a thick stream of blood poured down onto the perfectly molded face of the figure in the coffin, and as the vein sought to heal itself again, Lestat gashed it and let the blood flow. Help me, Merrick. Help me, David, he called out. What I've begun, I'll pay for, but do not let it fail. I need you now. And they keep basically just pouring blood on him. And then it ends with, suddenly a cry came from Merrick. I saw before me in the haze the figure of Louis sitting up from the coffin, his face a mass of tiny lines and wrinkles. I saw Lestat reach out for him and take hold of his head and press it to his throat. Drink now, Louis, he commanded. So, yeah, Armand could heal. Armand is choosing not to. And that in itself is such a display of Armand's cruelty in this scene. And Armand's cruelty continues as we get to our next scene, which is the Lestat phone call as Armand puts Louis in his coffin. Armand's jealousy and feelings of inadequacy are the first things that we see here. He goes, I listened to the tapes twice, all of them. Lestat, Lestat, Claudia, Lestat, Lestat. And Louis, for the second time, brings up that all I did was talk trash about him. And Armand goes, yes, but why? And then he begins to discuss this whole, did I catch you in a fantasy where somehow this boy publishes your interview and Lestat sees it sitting on a bookshelf and comes to find you again? And this is, of course, slightly hysterical, given that this is exactly how the transition between Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat happens in the novels. So in the Vampire Lestat, quite literally, it opens with Lestat awakening for the first time in quite a while, and he's awakened by rock music of all things, and eventually when he's strong enough, he goes to a local little rock band in New Orleans and introduces himself as Lestat. And this happens, like I said, really early. It's on page 11. He says, the men, Alex, the sleek, delicate young drummer, and his taller, blonde-haired brother Larry, recognized my name when I told them it was Lestat. Not only did they recognize it, but they connected it with a body of information about me that they had read in a book. In fact, they thought it was delightful that I wasn't just pretending to be any vampire, or Count Dracula. Everybody was sick of Count Dracula. They thought it was marvelous that I was pretending to be the Vampire Lestat. Pretending to be the Vampire Lestat, I asked, and they laughed at my exaggeration, my French accent. I looked at them for a long moment, trying to scan their thoughts. Of course, I hadn't expected them to believe I was a real vampire, but to have read a fictional vampire with a name as unusual as mine? How could this be explained? But I was losing my confidence, and when I lose my confidence, my powers drain. The little room seemed to be getting smaller, and there was something insectal and menacing about the instruments, the antenna, the wires. Show me this book, I said. From the other room they brought it, a small pulp paper novel that was falling to pieces. The binding was gone, the cover ripped, the whole thing held together by a rubber band. I got a chill of sorts at the sight of the cover. Interview with the Vampire. Something to do with a mortal boy getting one of the undead to tell the tale. With their permission, I went into the other room, stretched out on the bed, and began to read. When I was halfway finished, I took the book with me and left the house. I stood stock still beneath a street lamp with the book until I finished it. Then I placed it carefully in my breast pocket. I didn't return to the band for 7 nights. So, continuing on with page 12, which is where I was, his anger at this discovery shows itself like right near the bottom of the page. And it says, during much of that time, I was roaming again, crashing through the night on my Harley-Davidson motorcycle, which Rockstar Lestat era is a whole different beast. And I was asking myself, Lestat, what do you want to do now? And the rest of the time I studied with a renewed purpose. I read the paperback histories and lexicons of rock music, the chronicles of its stars. I listened to the albums and pondered in silence the concert videotapes. And when the night was empty and still, I heard the voices of Interview with the Vampire singing to me as if they sang from the grave. I read the book over and over, and then, in a moment of contemptible anger, I shredded it to bits. So that all happens, but it's actually on page 14 that this exact scenario that Armand is talking about happens. And it says, as I walked up the busy avenue, I covered my eyes with mirrored sunglasses. I rode the rickety old St. Charles streetcar downtown. And through the early evening crowd, I wandered into the elegant double-decker bookstore called the DeVille Books, and there stared at the small paperback of Interview with the Vampire on the shelf. I wondered how many of our kind had noticed the book. Never mind for the moment the mortals who thought it was fiction. What about other vampires? Because if there is one law that all vampires hold sacred, it is that you do not tell mortals about us. And like there's my beloved Louis, the narrator of Interview with the Vampire, had done all this. He had gone far beyond my secret little disclosure to my rock singers. He had told hundreds of thousands of readers. He had all but drawn them a map and placed an X on the very spot in New Orleans where I slumbered, though what he really knew about that and what his intentions were was not clear. So, like, this is a real thing that happens, right? But going back to the show, Armand immediately following this whole was it a fantasy that I caught you in, falls into classic abuser language. He's self-deprecating. He's pointing out how awful Lestat was in comparison for like Louis, but very fine. If you want his abuse instead of my kindness and empathy that I give, be my guest, sort of air to the whole conversation. And then he calls Lestat. And he says basically like, hey Louis, I'm going to leave you now. Yes, I'm leaving you in the state that you're in a state in which if you're left alone, you will probably die. But before I go, here's Lestat, and I'll talk for you too. Only Armand, even planning on leaving Louis, can't repeat the final devastating tell him I love him, Armand. Crossing fingers for anyway. All right, I promise I'm almost done talking about favorite scenes, but I can't not talk about Armand's speech to Daniel before he's about to kill him. Because this is one of those moments where I really wish that I was more eloquent. I would love to put something together talking about the actual speech itself, but my brain's still currently broken from the episode, and so I'm just gonna talk about how gorgeous the scene is. The music is lulling. The tone that Armand is speaking in is lulling. Daniel's quiet is lulling. It really would be an easeful death, you know? And the scene is so gripping and you feel entirely on edge and you're terrified for what's about to happen, and yet you want to see where it goes. And then it's cut off and Louis has dragged his excruciatingly pain-filled self out of the bed to save Daniel. And he says that sparing Daniel will be this testament to their companionship, just like Claudia was a testament to Loustat and Louis' companionship. But Assad was so unbelievable in this scene. He was beautiful, gentleman death personified. And in fact, I've been thinking about the line about easeful death because it seems to come straight from John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, a poem that can relate quite heavily to this season of Interview with a Vampire, given all the bird imagery, the different deaths that happen throughout the poem, and the topic of immortality. And the stanza that this easeful death directly comes from goes like this. You're gonna have to forgive me. This is like the closest copy of Keats' stuff I had on the shelf, and it's from 1881, so it's like falling apart. But the stanza says, darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever it seems rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. And that's kind of how, that's the tone of this entire poem, is just death and welcoming it in a lot of ways. John Keats is my favorite poet. My dog's name is Keats. And Anne Rice mentions Keats a decent amount in the books. There's actually a part in the Vampire Armand where Armand's talking about Louis, and it like the line's like, sweet dusty Louis reading Keats by the candlelight or something. But anyway, regarding the scene in Armand's easeful death, I could watch it over and over and over again. It is a beautiful scene for all the horror that it does encompass. And this easeful death scene leads us into the last thing I want to talk about, which is what I call the Pebble Pit conversation that happens between Louis and Daniel at the end. So Daniel jumps up as soon as this last memory finishes, and you can tell that Louis thinks that he's upset him, but Daniel immediately comes back and he reads the words that Louis said to him after Armand did spare him out of this testament to their companionship. And they are words that Daniel has lived his entire life by, not even knowing that it was Louis. And it's a really short scene because it's one that's quickly stopped by Armand's reappearance following his lunch. But it is a vulnerable scene between Louis and Daniel, a scene in which Daniel shows his first like real signs of heavy emotional break as he recounts his life and how the interview in 1973 impacted it. And it's a scene that really cements something I'm going to talk about later, which is the dynamic shift of Armand and Louis versus Daniel to a situation that is now Louis and Daniel versus Armand. All right, after that long ramble about favorite scenes, let's start diving into the second category, which is Big Talk, the category in which I discuss recurring themes that happen throughout the show. Today I'm going to be talking about three things: power, abuse, and immortality. Beginning with power, episode 4 gives us this really interesting look into the exchange of power Louis and Armand want to pretend exists between them. But it's this episode that showcases how non-existent that exchange really is. Because in the book, Louis' arrival in Paris is not all that different from the show. Having fled New Orleans following the murder of Lestat, Louis and Claudia take to Eastern Europe and run into the revenant vampires that provide them with no answers for the questions that they have. When they get to Paris and they meet the coven, there's a hope that Louis has that Armand, who is powerful and old, will be able to lead him in the way that Lestat never did. And it's something that stands out in the show. Louis is looking for answers. He's looking for someone to safely take him on this journey through this immortal life, because somehow, in some way, he's more lost than ever. Only, as it is in the books, Armand's presence doesn't quiet this discontent that he has, and in the show, Louis' discontent being centered on the absence of Loustat is even more prominent than it is in the book, though it is there in the book. But Louis and Armand are too alike. And it's something that Louis talks about on page 305 of the novel. And he's talking to Armand and he says, because this whole long speech, and it's very philosophical and existential, but it ends with, "And so that passion, that love you saw in me was extinguished, and you now see simply a mirror of yourself." Okay? And this whole being a mirror thing is alluded to by Armand when he's kind of talking about why their relationship failed. And so on page 270 of the Vampire Armand, he says, "The very avowal brought me a crushing sense of loneliness, and when I looked into Louis' tortured face, when I followed his slim, delicate figure as it picked its way through the clutter in 19th century Paris, I knew that this black-clad, dark-haired gentleman, so lean, so finely sculpted, so sensitive, was the alluring embodiment of the misery I felt." And episode 4 shows us that Armand is looking for somebody to lead him to. And it's as though Louis is trying in episode 4 at this point to accept that, all right, I'm not going to find a leader and I'm going to make peace with that. And so I will continue to try to be things that I'm not, just as I was before Lestat came to me and gave me this vampiric life, a life that he promised would be filled with all the beautiful things that I really was for all eternity. And Armand, saying that Louis is this leader that he's looking for, goes, you're in control. And Louis, vampirically weaker than he's ever been in his life in this situation, says that he takes this control because what else is he supposed to do? Who else is there for him? And again, then this episode happens and we see that this power exchange is entirely fake because Armand controls everything. He even controls the amount of power that they like to pretend Louis has. And so this relationship at its core can't work because both Armand and Louis need a leader. And that just simply isn't either of them. Not really. And I think it explains why both have had a gravitational pull to Lestat, who is a leader. But yeah, power. All right, next I will be talking about abuse a little bit, so please do what you need to regarding this particular subject matter. Abuse has shown its ugly face many times throughout the series already, and I know that it will continue to do so as the series goes on, because abuse shapes so many of the vampires. And it's not lost on anyone, I don't think, that season 1 episode 5 is an episode that highlights the domestic abuse faced in the Rue Royale household. And now here we are with season 2 episode 5, and we're seeing abuse still, just with somebody else. There's a lot of classic abuser language that Armand uses when talking to Louis, language that has Louis repeatedly apologizing for what he said, for what happened, even as he's the one laying there in a shell-shocked kind of pain, even as Armand never apologizes himself, not once during this scene. And when their fight first started... All right, lastly, I have my personal favorite category, which is my predictions for the future. Today I have 4 things that I want to talk about, and the first one is the one I think is the most obvious, which is the Dubai dynamic shift. So we've seen this episode, and it's happened already. Armand is now facing Daniel and Louis as this united front, rather than it being Armand and Louis facing Daniel. And my essential prediction is that I don't see this changing. I don't see it ever going back to how it was at this point. Daniel's blatant care for Louis, the way that the next few episodes are set to only bring out the worst parts of Louis and Armand's relationship, all the way from Paris to now, and the way that Louis and Armand have already been together far too long in terms of like the novel. There's just no way that this season ends with any chance of Louis and Armand still being together, which I know we all knew it wouldn't happen, but there's no chance it happens this season even. Like, they're done. In fact, I would put money on Daniel, almost for like all of his humanity, not allowing that to happen. I think Armand already has and is going to feel the change in the air, and I am terrified and curious as to how he plans to deal with that. And it has me wondering if the Talamasca are going to have to intervene in Dubai at all. The next thing I want to talk about is the Lestat Louis reunion that we're hopefully getting this season. In Interview with the Vampire, the novel, Louis goes back to New Orleans at the end, and he finds Lestat in a house there. And Lestat's a little out of it. Very much a shell of who he once was. And then you read the Vampire Lestat, and Lestat's like, this never happened. I don't know. But I do think that the show's gonna go down the first route. Based on the soundtrack, based on the prediction that I made in my first video about New Orleans Louis returning to us by the end of the season, and based on the general knowledge that we have that they did film in New Orleans very briefly at the end of the season, I think Lestat's there. I think he's home, and I do think that Louis is going to find him there. Crossing fingers. But as for how that reunion will go exactly, I'm not sure yet. In the books, Lestat's really out of it. Like I said, he is mentally too out of it to be having like a full conversation. And in some ways, I think it would be a disservice to have him in that kind of state, to have him that lost when Louis finds him and they find each other again. Especially given what Sam Reed said in the TV Insider interview about Lestat thinking that Louis has been dead since 1973, and given how that telepathic phone call with Armand really did go. And I do think, should they reunite in New Orleans, they won't get back together right away. I think they will come together organically somehow when Louis hasn't just exited a relationship that he's been in for a lifetime, when Lestat hasn't been alone for 70 years. when they can be together as passionately in love as they've always been without the world bearing down on their shoulders. But I do think that's how that's gonna go. Going back now to immortality a little bit, I do want to talk about Daniel calling vampirism the dark gift. So when hearing how Louis is discussing how he wanted to die following Claudia's first attempted escape to Europe, Daniel's like, oh, come on, you've been given the gift. You're gonna throw it all away, and like, what about all the good that the gift has to offer, or something, to that effect. And I think, one, that this is a classic, like, the grass is greener on the other side moment. But I also think, too, that this is the key to Louis being actually able to move on in the current time. This interview is so twisted around Louis's guilt and grief over the death of Claudia. And it's something that he cannot forgive himself for. And it seems to be something that he's not really in a hurry to try to forgive himself for either. But if he doesn't, he is just going to continue on the same cycle of wanting to die and then finding something to kind of live for, or like half living for a while, then wanting to die and then finding something. And it's just going to continue over and over and over again. And even though this gift comment is initially made in 1973, my prediction is that it's going to get brought up again in the modern time. And my elaborated prediction on that is that, we've had now that Louis's words were Daniel's lifeline, that they were the thing that Daniel needed the most at the lowest points. And now I think that that's going to be returned to Louis from Daniel, that Daniel's words will be the lifeline for Louis, and that he's never going to be able to forget, not again, but he will be able to forgive and to live and to want to treat vampirism as the gift that it really was intended to be from the beginning, no matter how messed up it can be at times. Lastly, I do want to talk about what I believe the full extent of Armand's role in the trial is, as well as what I think Lestat's role in the trial will be made to be. I don't think that Louis knows the role that Armand played in Claudia's death. Obviously, we know that there's something. Armand says it in this episode about atoning for Paris. In the books, yes, Louis and Armand are together like forever and ever, but their relationship is extremely cold and distant all the time. And obviously we're witnessing that their relationship is definitely a mess, but the show has made it clear that there were a lot of moments of love since Paris, that there have been times that they've been happy since Paris, that they can put on the show for Daniel without trying too hard, because there was something there, and there's something that maybe could still be there, depending. And I don't think that that would be possible if Louis knew Armand's role in Claudia's death, at least not the extent of it. So my prediction for Armand regarding the trial is that he's either changed the memory in Louis's head, or he's simply been really good at lying since the 1940s. And that when Louis does find out, it's going to change everything. Now, Lestat's a little bit more complicated. When is he not? In the book, his role in Claudia's death is pretty known and not remotely hidden. Actually, on page 265 of Interview with a Vampire is when the trial starts. And it's when Louis sees Lestat for the first time since New Orleans. And the conversation and the narration kind of go as follows, and I'm going to jump around a little, but as soon as we were dragged into the Théâtre des Vampires, I was crying out for Armand. I was let go only to stagger on the cellar steps, the horde of them behind me and in front of me, pushing me with menacing hands. At one point I got hold of Celeste, and she screamed and someone struck me from behind. And then I saw Loustat, the blow that was more crippling than any blow. Lestat standing there in the center of the ballroom, erect, his gray eyes sharp and focused, his mouth lengthening in a cunning smile. Impeccably dressed he was, as always, and as splendid in his rich black coat and fine linen. But those scars still scored every inch of his white flesh, and how they distorted the taut, handsome face, the fine, hard threads cutting the delicate skin above his lip, the lids of his eyes, the smooth rise of his forehead, and the eyes, they burned with a silent rage that seemed infused with vanity, an awful, relentless vanity that said, "See what I am?" "This is the one," said Santiago, thrusting me forward. But Lestat turned sharply to him and said in a harsh, low voice, "I told you I wanted Claudia, the child. She was the one." And now I saw his head moving involuntarily with his outburst, and his hand reaching out as if for the arm of a chair, only to close as he drew himself up again, eyes to me. "Lestat," I began, seeing now the few straws left to me. "You're alive. You have your life. Tell them how you treated us." "No." He shook his head furiously. "You come back to me, Louis," he said. For a moment I could not believe my ears. Some saner, more desperate part of me said, "Reason with him," even as the sinister laughter erupted from my lips. "Are you mad?" "I'll give you back your life," he said, his eyelids quivering with the stress of his words, his chest heaving, that hand going out again and closing impotently in the dark. "You promised me," he said to Santiago, "I could take him back with me to New Orleans." And then as he looked from one to the other of them as they surrounded us, his breath became frantic and he burst out, "Claudia, where is she? She's the one who did it to me. I told you." And Santiago makes an argument that, well, Louis helped. And on page 267, Lestat says, "She did it to me, Louis. She did it to me. You didn't. She has to die," said Lestat, his voice becoming thin, rasping as if it were an effort for him to speak. "Get that thing away from here." He's talking about the coffin they're going to put Louis in. "He's coming home with me," he said furiously to Santiago. And Santiago only laughed, and Celeste laughed, and the laughter seemed to infect them all. "You promised me," said Lestat to them. "I promised you nothing," said Santiago. I think it would be a disservice to change this too much as well, because sort of like how the show has shown us Armand's ability to be cruel, Lestat's ability to be cruel is part of who he is. But all that being said, I think through lies and some mind manipulation, or maybe just perception alone, it's going to be made to look as though Lestat was the mastermind behind every single detail in this trial. And I talked about that a little bit in my season 2 episode 3 thing, but I think that might explain why Louis will have some severe trepidation in seeing Lestat again in this like modern time period, because if he thinks that Lestat truly was the one that orchestrated every aspect of that trial, why on earth would he be able to trust himself around him, you know? All right, and that is all for this week's Quick View with the Vampire, a review of Interview with the Vampire, Season 2, Episode 5. Don't be afraid, just start the tape. If you stuck around, thank you so much for watching. I'm anticipating our last 3 episodes to get worse and worse in terms of the psychological torture. So I'm trying my best to prepare for this week's episode alone. Can't even imagine the rest of the season. I do, however, have a video that will be going up on Thursday in which I will be discussing in a severe amount of detail Season 2, Episode 3, No Pain, and particularly the 1700s flashbacks, all in comparison and contrast with what those 1700s flashbacks look like within the novels, as well as what I think it means for Lestat's backstory, a centerpiece for the upcoming season, no doubt. So if that does spark any interest, please keep an eye on the channel, as that will be going up as I continue to picket the streets for the Season 3 renewal. Because this next video is basically me just going, "But Season 3," repeatedly. Until then though, I will be uploading some screenshots of the episodes onto my Instagram and ranting and raving much more incoherently on Twitter. So follow me along there. Also follow me along on Twitter for live tweets of the episodes. I do that every week and usually have some weird interaction with the Immortal AMC account. So if you want to check out what random things I've got to say during the episodes, follow me there. But I will see you guys next time for 1700s and then for Quickview with the Vampire episode 6. But he goes ahead and he does it. So in 285 it says, he drew back, kneeling up, and lifting his right hand to his mouth, he gashed his wrist with his own teeth before either Merrick or I knew what he meant to do. At once a thick stream of blood poured down onto the perfectly molded face of the figure in the coffin, and as the vein sought to heal itself, again Lestat gashed it and let the blood flow. "Help me, Merrick, help me, David," he called out. "What I've begun I'll pay for, but do not let it fail. I need you." Perfect. I'm so good at my job. Feel like Dale Jennings reading off the teleprompter. Try not to read too fast. I don't know what I'm doing.